Obinna was known in the village as a wise and respected teacher, a man everyone trusted with both knowledge and advice. When he finally chose a wife, the whole community was eager to see who she would be. Her name was Ngozi, a quiet woman from a nearby town. She carried herself with calmness, speaking little but always watching closely, and many admired her beauty and soft voice. On the surface, their marriage looked peaceful, even perfect. Obinna smiled more, and people said she took good care of him. Yet, from the first day she entered the village, whispers followed her. Old women exchanged knowing looks, saying her family was known for strange practices. Some said her mother once performed secret rituals, others claimed her relatives were avoided because they mixed traditions that ordinary people feared. Whenever Ngozi walked to the stream, children paused to stare at her, and elders would lower their voices, saying, "That one is not as simple as she looks." Obinna, however, ignored the talk. He believed people only gossiped because she was different and came from another town. He told himself love was stronger than rumors. But soon, little things began to unsettle him. Sometimes at night, he noticed Ngozi staying awake long after he had closed his eyes, sitting quietly, almost as if she was watching him. At times, she hummed low songs he did not recognize, words heavy with meanings he could not understand. Yet every morning, she smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. Still, Obinna brushed away his doubts. He was grateful to have a wife, and he told his friends that Ngozi was simply private, not strange. The villagers, however, did not stop talking. They said men who ignored warning signs often lived to regret it. They spoke of marriages where hidden secrets later destroyed the husband's peace. For Obinna, love had blinded him, and he did not realize that the whispers around him were not just idle gossip. They were quiet warnings of what was yet to come. At first, Obinna thought it was nothing more than stress from teaching, but soon his nights turned into battles he could not control. Every time he closed his eyes, strange dreams came to him, dark forests where shadows chased him, rivers turning into blood, and voices calling his name from places he could not see. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his chest pounding as though he had been running for hours. Sometimes, Ngozi would place a hand on his back, whispering that it was only a dream, but her calmness made him uneasy. It felt as if she already knew what he had seen. Morning after morning, he rose from bed weaker than the night before. His body grew thin, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He no longer walked with the same strength that once made him stand tall in the village square. His students noticed his tired face, and his friends whispered that something was eating away at him. Some nights he gasped for air as if invisible hands were pressing down on his chest, and he would struggle until he woke up trembling. The nightmares became so real that he started fearing sleep itself. He tried praying before bed, hoping the darkness would leave him alone, but the dreams only grew stronger. Even when he lay beside his wife, comfort never came. The moment he drifted into sleep, it was as if another world claimed him, pulling him deeper into fear. Villagers began to see the change in him. The once energetic teacher now moved slowly, his voice weak and uncertain. People asked if he was sick, but he shook his head, not knowing how to explain the torment that haunted him only at night. He did not yet realize that the answer to his suffering lay not in his body, but in the very place he rested his head each evening. The pillow he trusted for peace was slowly becoming the source of his destruction. It was common in the village to wash clothes, bedsheets, and sometimes even mats, but no one ever bothered to wash a simple cotton pillow. That was why people started watching Ngozi closely. Every week, she carried Obinna's pillow to the stream, scrubbing it with unusual care as though it was made of silk. Women at the river whispered among themselves, wondering why a pillow needed such constant washing. They noticed the way Ngozi never allowed anyone else near it, not even Obinna. Whenever someone tried to touch it or offer help, she would quickly snatch it back, her eyes sharp, her hands tightening as if protecting a treasure. At home, she kept the pillow separate from the others. She would spread it under the sun longer than normal, watching carefully until it dried. Sometimes, she sprinkled herbs over it before bringing it inside, pretending it was just her way of keeping it fresh. But the villagers were not convinced. They had lived long enough to know when something was ordinary and when it carried a secret. Obinna himself began to notice the strange behavior. Whenever he tried to move the pillow or lay on it differently, Ngozi's eyes followed him with a hidden fear. Once, he jokingly asked why she guarded it like gold, and she laughed nervously, saying she only wanted her husband's head to rest on something clean. Yet, the more she tried to explain, the more suspicious it sounded. The women in the village soon spread the story from one compound to another. They said no wife cared about a pillow unless it carried more than feathers inside. Children were warned not to wander too close to Ngozi when she was washing, and even elders began to shake their heads in worry. To outsiders, it may have looked like simple care for her husband, but to those who watched closely, it was clear, Ngozi's attention to that pillow was not natural. She was guarding it as though it carried a secret powerful enough to change Obinna's life forever. One afternoon, Obinna's childhood friend, Chika, came to visit. They had grown up together, sharing secrets, hunting in the bush, and studying under the same village tree. Chika knew Obinna better than most people, and he quickly noticed how weak and restless his friend had become. As they sat in the room, talking quietly, Chika's nose caught a sharp, unpleasant smell. It was not the normal scent of sweat or damp clothes. It was stronger, sour, like something rotten hiding close by. He looked around, his eyes settling on the pillow resting neatly on Obinna's bed. At first, Chika tried to ignore it, but the smell grew worse the longer he sat there. Finally, he leaned closer and realized the foul scent was coming directly from the pillow his friend used every night. His heart skipped. He turned to Obinna and asked when last the pillow had been changed. Obinna laughed weakly, saying Ngozi washed it often, maybe too often, but he had never thought much of it. Chika frowned. He knew no ordinary pillow could carry such a heavy odor, even if washed daily. Something inside it was not right. He looked at his friend, pale and tired, and his chest tightened. He told Obinna plainly that something strange was in his own bedroom. "Brother," he said, "this pillow is not normal. You cannot keep laying your head on it." Obinna tried to dismiss the warning, saying Ngozi was only being careful, but deep inside, doubt began to grow. Chika was not a man to speak without reason. He reminded Obinna that he had been smelling the rot with his own nose. He urged him to be careful, to pay attention to the things happening under his own roof. Obinna listened quietly, but fear crept into his heart. For the first time, he wondered if the whispers about Ngozi were true. And as Chika left that evening, his words echoed in the room, "Your danger may already be lying under your head." That night, Obinna could not sleep. Chika's warning kept echoing in his mind, and the foul smell from the pillow seemed stronger than ever. He turned on the bed, his body restless, his mind racing with fear. Ngozi had gone to visit her cousin in the next compound, leaving him alone in the room. For the first time, Obinna stared at the pillow not as a comfort, but as a threat. His heart pounded as he reached for it, his hands trembling. He hesitated, remembering how carefully Ngozi always guarded it, but curiosity and fear pushed him further. Slowly, he tore at the seam with his fingers, ripping the fabric apart. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. Instead of the soft cotton he expected, his eyes fell on dried feathers, their tips darkened with old stains. Mixed with them were small clumps, sticky and red, like traces of dried blood that had long seeped into the fabric. The smell hit him full in the face, rotten, heavy, and unnatural. His stomach churned, and for a moment, he thought he might vomit. Obinna dropped the pillow, his chest heaving. He could not believe that the place where he laid his head every night was filled with such things. Questions rushed through his mind. Why would his wife bury feathers and blood inside a pillow? What purpose could it serve? He remembered her late-night songs, her constant washing, her refusal to let anyone else touch it. Suddenly, all those moments made terrible sense. Fear gripped him, but he forced himself to gather the pieces back into the torn pillow, not wanting her to know he had discovered her secret. He sat there shaking, staring at the bed, unable to breathe normally. The room that once felt safe now seemed heavy with unseen forces. For the first time, Obinna realized his suffering was not a sickness of the body but something darker, planted under his head by the woman he called his wife. When Ngozi returned home that evening, Obinna could no longer hold his silence. His heart was heavy, his eyes filled with both anger and fear. He waited until she set down her basket, then pulled the pillow forward, its torn seam exposing the feathers and stains he had found. "What is this, Ngozi?" he demanded, his voice trembling. She froze, her eyes widening for only a moment before she quickly forced a smile, as though it was nothing unusual. But Obinna pressed harder, his tone rising, asking again and again why a pillow meant for rest was filled with blood and feathers. Finally, Ngozi sighed and sat down, her calmness unsettling him even more. She admitted she had buried a small chicken inside the pillow before their marriage. Her explanation poured out smoothly. She said it was for protection, to keep him safe from harm, and to bind their love so that no other woman could ever come between them. She looked at him with pleading eyes, insisting that everything she did was out of care, that it was a wife's way of ensuring her husband remained hers alone. But Obinna's chest tightened with unease. Love, he thought, should not smell like rot or make a man wake gasping for air. He confided in Chika the next day, and his friend's face darkened with fear. Chika leaned close and whispered what Obinna already dreaded, that such acts were not about love or protection. They were dark rituals, dangerous practices whispered about in old tales. A chicken buried in a pillow was not a charm of affection, but a way of chaining a man's spirit, draining him slowly until he was weak and bound to his wife forever. Obinna felt the ground shift beneath him. His wife's gentle words now sounded like poison, sweetened to hide the truth. He realized the woman he trusted most had tied him to something far darker than marriage. The pillow he once laid his head upon was not a symbol of comfort, it was the trap that was stealing his very life. By the next morning, the story had already left Obinna's compound and was traveling across the village like wildfire. At the stream, women whispered while pounding clothes, their voices low but filled with fear. In the market, traders leaned across their stalls, shaking their heads as they repeated the tale of Ngozi burying a chicken inside her husband's pillow. Children carried the rumor too, running through the dusty paths, their laughter carrying words they barely understood. Everyone spoke about it, and everywhere Obinna walked, he felt eyes following him. The elders were the most troubled. They gathered under the big tree at the center of the village, their faces grave as they recalled stories from the past. They said rituals like this were not new, that long ago women who feared losing their husbands turned to dark practices to keep them. The price, however, was always heavy. Such acts did not bring true love, only chains. The man's spirit would slowly weaken, his body drained of strength until he could no longer think clearly or live freely. He would belong to his wife not by choice, but by force, bound forever. Some elders muttered that this was worse than poison, because poison killed quickly, but a ritual like this destroyed a man slowly, until nothing of him remained. They warned that if the ritual was not broken, Obinna's fate was sealed. He might live for years, but he would not live as himself. He would be a shadow, trapped under his wife's control. The villagers grew restless, keeping their distance from Ngozi whenever she passed. Some women crossed themselves, others spat on the ground to ward off evil. They feared that if such practices were allowed to continue, more homes could be cursed. For Obinna, the whispers cut deep. What had once been gossip about a strange wife was now a terrifying truth. His marriage was no longer seen as ordinary, it had become a story of fear, warning everyone about how dangerous love could be when tied to darkness. Chika could no longer sit and watch his friend fade away. Obinna's face was pale, his shoulders weak, and his once bright eyes looked lost. One evening, after listening to him cough and struggle for breath, Chika decided it was time to act. He took Obinna by the arm and led him quietly out of the compound, away from Ngozi's watchful eyes. They walked through the dark paths of the village until they reached the edge, where Mama Ifeoma, the well-known spiritual healer, lived in a small mud house surrounded by herbs and charms. Mama Ifeoma was feared and respected. She was old, her hair white as cotton, but her eyes sharp and knowing. When Obinna and Chika entered, she did not ask many questions. She looked at Obinna for a long time, then nodded as if she already understood. She asked them to sit, and when Chika explained about the pillow filled with feathers and blood, Mama Ifeoma's face grew heavy. She shook her head slowly and said, "This is not a charm of love. It is a chain." Her words sent a chill down Obinna's spine. She explained that such rituals were meant to bind a man's soul, to weaken him until he had no strength to resist his wife. It was not protection, but control. If left unbroken, she warned, Obinna's spirit would keep draining until there was nothing left of him. His body might live, but his soul would belong to Ngozi completely. Obinna's heart pounded as Mama Ifeoma leaned closer, telling him he was already deep in danger. "You have only little time," she said. "If we do not break it soon, you will not see many more moons." Chika gripped his friend's shoulder, urging him to trust her. Obinna sat in silence, fear tightening his chest. For the first time, he realized that what he thought was love had turned into a trap that could cost him his very life. That night, Mama Ifeoma prepared her shrine for the cleansing. The air was thick with the smell of burning herbs, and the flicker of oil lamps threw long shadows against the mud walls. Obinna sat trembling, clutching his chest, while Chika stood beside him, determined to see the ritual through. In the center of the room lay the cursed pillow, torn at the seams, its foul odor filling the space. Mama Ifeoma sprinkled white chalk around it, then placed a clay pot of water mixed with bitter leaves and ash by her side. She began to chant, her voice deep and steady, calling on spirits of light to break the darkness. The sound of rattles and drums filled the night as her apprentices joined in, their hands raised toward the sky. The tension was heavy, as though the very air resisted the prayers. Obinna's head throbbed, his body shaking with each word spoken, as if something inside him was fighting back. Finally, Mama Ifeoma commanded that the pillow be taken outside. They carried it to the open yard, where a fire had been prepared. With a final prayer, she threw the pillow into the flames. At first, it burned like cloth, feathers curling into smoke. But then, something happened that made everyone's blood run cold. From within the fire came the sound of a chicken crying, loud, desperate, alive. The villagers who had gathered gasped and stepped back in fear. The flames roared higher, and the cries grew louder until, suddenly, they stopped. Obinna collapsed to the ground, coughing as if something heavy had been lifted from his chest. His body shook violently, then stilled. Mama Ifeoma lifted her staff and declared that the chain had been broken. The crowd whispered in disbelief, staring at the fire that still crackled with the smell of blood and feathers. That night, no one forgot what they had witnessed. A pillow meant for rest had turned into a prison, and the burning of it revealed the darkness hidden inside. The cry of the chicken proved it had never truly died. It had been living in Obinna's spirit all along. When the fire finally died and silence returned to the compound, Obinna sat on the ground, his body weak but his spirit lighter than it had been in months. For the first time in a long while, he could breathe without feeling invisible hands pressing against his chest. Yet as relief washed over him, a heavier burden entered his heart. It was not the ritual itself that crushed him, but the truth that his own wife, the woman he had welcomed into his life, was the one who betrayed him. Ngozi stood a few steps away, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and shame. She tried to speak, to tell him once more that it was all done out of love, that she only wanted to protect their marriage. But Obinna no longer heard her words as comfort. They were poison disguised as sweetness. How could love be proven by blood and feathers? How could a wife claim care while slowly stealing her husband's spirit? The villagers waited, watching to see what choice he would make. Mama Ifeoma had done her part, the chains were broken. Now it was left for Obinna to decide whether he would remain in the same house with a woman who had nearly cost him his life. His heart battled within him. Part of him remembered her quiet smile, her gentle hands when they first married. Another part remembered the nights of nightmares, the suffocation, the betrayal he uncovered with his own hands. In the end, Obinna rose to his feet, his voice steady though his heart was heavy. He told Ngozi that trust once broken could never be whole again. He could forgive her as a human being, but he could not remain as her husband. With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in silence. That night, the village learned a lesson it would never forget. Love bound by darkness is not love at all, and no marriage built on fear can ever truly stand.